In the 1700s, an outcast turned king revolutionized everything about the South African areas at that time. He communicated with groups as far as Mozambique and was looking forward to the contacts that he could make with the Europeans that were constantly pressing towards these territories. He opened up trade for beads made of glass that were utilized within the kingdom in a way that had never been done before. This culture seemed to some historians something that was embedded within the culture of the Zulus. Some even thought it was somewhere between the 1600s and the 1500s. What surprised them was finding out that the export of glass beads all the way to South Africa goes back further than 500 years. In fact, it goes back further, double that time. 1,000 years before Shaka Zulu, 700 AD, evidence came out that glass beads had made their way all the way to the southern tip of Africa, and not Sofala. Sofala was just the limit where Arabs stopped traveling, where Indian traders would leave their goods, where Indonesians would land their boats. But further down, the trade would go. The people of Sofala would trade with the people in South Africa, and the people in South Africa would trade with the people in internal Southern Africa. This is from a paper by Marilee Wood in University of Witwatersrand, and they talk about the glass beads that have been found and dated. And most of these beads are dated to about the 9th century to the 13th century. So the ones from the 7th century to about the 9th century are different than the ones from the 9th century to about the 13th century. So let's quickly read this. Between the 9th and the 15th century AD, the glass beads found in archaeological context in most of southern Africa can be separated into series based on morphological characteristics. Chemical analysis has supported and helped refine these series and show that the origins of the glass used to make the beads vary with the series. Several characteristics, including method of manufacture, end treatment, structure, shape, size, color, and translucency, are used to classify the beads. Because of some of the dates given to both Mapungubwe and Great Zimbabwe, there seemed to be a little bit of a problem, and it actually helped extend what we know about this civilization. So if we can read here, I've decided to Mtlamba longer beads into series that were developed for the Shashe Limpopo region, that's in South Africa. Those that are applicable here include the K2, which is made up of transparent to translucent blue green to light green beads that are often tubular in shape. They arrive in the region a few decades before AD 1000 and were no longer traded into the area after AD 1200. They were, however, often curated so appear in small number in later deposits. The Mapungubwe Oblate series is characterized by translucent, opaque glass in a range of colors, including blue, green, yellow, butterscotch, orange, and green. Opaque black is the most common color, while transparent cobalt blue and plum burgundy are rare. Many of these blue are oblate in shape, hence their name. Others are cylindrical with well-rounded ends. This series began arriving in Shashe Limpopo region sometime before AD 1250, by which time they appeared in enormous quantity. The end date for the series is not clear since Shasha Limpopo sites were abandoned in about AD 1300. However, this series is found at Great Zimbabwe and related sites where it was followed by the Zimbabwe series. The Zimbabwe series is closely related to Mapungubwe Oblate series, both morphologically and chemically, and is surely a continuation of the earlier one, but subtle changes are evident. The glass used to make most colors, excluding black, is less opaque and ranges from almost transparent to translucent. New colors appear as well, including a translucent light lime green and a transparent dark green. Chemical analysis shows that some opaque brownish red beads also belong to this series. In earlier studies, Zimbabwe series beads were not recognized at Mapungubwe. Now, of course, those areas are very typical and known by anyone who knows about African history, but it goes further than that. When we look at later papers that talk about South Africa, we can see in a place called Ndondondwane in KwaZulu Natal in South Africa that there are gloss beads recovered as early as 700 or 900 AD. This is from a paper by Gavin Whitelaw in 2019. It's called The Digging Stick. So let's read this part. Nearly all excavated in Jegane phase AD 950 to 1060 features yielded glass beads, proving or providing 52 out of the total bead count for the site of 189. They are cylindrical and tubular drawn beads between 2 millimeters and 5 millimeters in length and width, and mainly dark in color. They possibly belong to Merrily Wood's East Coast India Indo-Pacific series, which appeared in the Mapungubwe landscape after AD 950. The glass beads are significant because until now, only three EIE sites in KwaZulu Natal have yielded glass beads. One from each site. One came from Njagane from a late Ndondondwane phase pit that Mags excavated. The three beads are all cut tubes, bluish in color, and probably of the older Zizo bead series. The glass beads, of course, relate to the Indian Ocean trade system. Ashley Kutu's work suggests that EIA communities in the KwaZulu Natal region were exporting elephant ivory into the trade system from as early as the AD 700s. Evidence of goods received in return is rare and later in date, but includes the Zizo beads and a sherd of a glazed ceramic vessel made in Basra region of southern Iraq around AD 800. Research might in the future determine whether the 52 new beads are simply a continuation of this ancient trade or represent a different set of circumstances. This confirms a lot of what the early writers were saying about Southern Africa, because one of the writers, Al Masudi, says that people who were coming to that region were Indians. And in fact, another writer who was translated by an early Portuguese wrote that they saw in that region Indians. So, in other words, Indians had been trading from Sofala, the area known as Sofala, on their boats as far back as 700 AD. Now, some of these people thought that it was a brand new place and trade was not something that happened even back then. They thought that. But it seems like they were very mistaken, as you can see with the beads being found as far, I mean, as deep as southern Africa from around 700 AD. To put that in context, Muhammad died around 630 AD. And so 70 years later, there is transport coming down to South Africa. Now, of course, most people now believe that this trade is probably more ancient than that and that it's been going on for a long time. But not only that, there are countless civilizations like the Tamil civilizations of India that have documents that talk about the Western Ocean. The Western Ocean has a continent which they explain has a mountain on it. That might sound familiar to some of you, and it's talked about in India over and over again by different sections. By the time of these beads arriving in Africa, there is an empire called the Chola Empire, and this empire is connected to Myanmar, it's connected to Indonesia, it's connected to India, Pakistan, it's connected to so many different places. And one of the things that comes from its own writing is how far they traded. Of course, the architecture from the area is nothing short of spectacular, but the beads seem to come from this empire. The evidence of foreign trade within that is actually extensive and it's actually been studied by a lot of people, and they've already included East Africa as part of the greater trade. But there is a word called Patina Palais. The Patina part means city, and the Palais part means desert, or that it means basically a port city. This is a part of the translation of this poem. The borders of the city with great fame are protected by the celestials. Swift horses with lifted heads arrive on ships from abroad. Sacks of black pepper arrive from inland by wagons. Gold comes from northern mountains. Sandalwood and ackle wood come from the western mountains, and materials come from the Ganges. Pearls come from the Southern Ocean, and coral comes from the Eastern Ocean. The yields of the river Kaveri, things from Azam, products made in Myanmar, and many rare and big things are piled up together on the wide streets, bending the land under. The hard thing to track about Africa is the fact that a lot of mentions of places in India have similar names to that in Africa. It's a pretty weird thing to say, but for the most part, the evidence comes from the Arabs themselves, detailing that they themselves saw Indians on the coast of Sofala. And then you hear from India, but again, the problem comes when it comes to words, that the people in India say that the people come from the southern oceans or the western oceans, which, of course, from the direction of India, we are in the south or the west inside of Africa. And this is the thing that makes it very interesting. So if we look at someone like Mapungubwe, which obviously has gold beads, has a golden rhino, and these beads are very similar to the ones that you will see in Great Zimbabwe. There's hundreds of them that have been collected from Great Zimbabwe that are now in museums. But these beads and all of that would have been the thing that would have been exported all the way to places like Indonesia. But again, when it comes down to it, for the most part, the evidence is Arab writing and obviously Indian and Indonesian writing, but the writing is a little vague. So, in other words, it speaks of a continent on the other side, it speaks of the West on the other side, it speaks of trade on the other side, and then there is a guild that exists at the exact same time. So, there are merchant guilds that are made in India at the exact same time, which started doing mass global trade to places like that would appear in southern Africa. The earliest of them being in like the Limpopo area, Mpumalanga areas. We don't know if these started developing because of a bigger trade or if they developed before and expanded. But one thing is certain, that the people of India and Indonesia traded for a long time for elephant tusks in Africa, gold, iron, and several other things. And these are written down. That's the weird thing. It's that all of this stuff is written down, but it needs a little bit more checking. One of the things we find when looking into the writings of the people in India and Indonesia and all of those is that they speak of a Indonesian slash Southeast Asian expansion that happens at the time, and then later the Chinese through Zheng come through. But in this early period, you see tons of Indians starting to dominate this area, which is why Tamil became one of the languages that is dominant in that region. Now, it would be much simpler if we could just dismiss things and go, well, Indonesia had nothing to do with it. Let's carry on with our lives. The only problem is we know that India, Indonesia, and all these places played a role in Africa because we have Indonesians literally genetically related to the people in Madagascar. And they got there in Madagascar supposedly earlier than the Africans did, which means that the trip from Madagascar to Indonesia is something that has been known for hundreds of years before this trade even began. Now, what's even stronger than that, of course, is the beads found in Africa that are Indian, but the writings of the Arabs at the time who say we saw the merchants, Indian merchants, by Africa. You see, before that, you could just say, oh, the beads were transported here by the Arabs. You could just do that. Like, okay, Arabs pass their beads around. The problem is the Arabs themselves say, no, we saw them. As of course, I'm going to read this part again. And remember, this is pre-Europeans coming in. This is in the 1100s to 1300s. At the south end of Pemba began Sofala country, blah, blah, blah. The section embraces the description. You first find two towns, or better, two big villages. In between there are villages and camps that resemble those of the Arabs. Those big villages are Jentamba and Dandama, Chindi and Quilimane, real places in Africa today. They are situated at the sea shore and rather small. The inhabitants are poor, miserable, and without resources to support them except iron. Of this metal, there are numerous mines in the mountain of Sofala. People of Zabaj or Zenej or Rene come hither for iron, which they carry to the continent and island of India. I'm going to say that again. They carry it to the continent and island of India, where they sell it for good money because it is an object of big trade and it has a huge market in India. So, what we're talking about here, before we carry on reading the last piece, is physical evidence of Indians in Africa, physical evidence, basically genetic mixed with genetic Indonesian Indians, which are in Madagascar, um, physical evidence in those glass beads, which there's more, but I'll talk about that in another time. And also, I'm going to talk about the Indian evidence, which there's more of later. But in order to do that, I'll have to discuss the entire of the Indonesian India taking over area. And then we carry on, and it says, for although there is good quality iron in the islands and mines of that country, it does not equal the iron of Sofala for its quality and its malleability. The Indians are masters in the art of working it. They prepare and mix the substances so that through fusion one gets the soft steel normally called India steel. They have factories that make the best swords in the world. This is how in Iron, Sind, Serenbid, and Yemen rival among each other in quality. Now, of course, something else happens at this date, which is the expansion of almost every civilization in the world, including those in the Americas. But again, that is a story for another day. The connection between India and Africa not only is written about as early as Al Masudi, as early as all these other people, but it has full proof. Now, I know some people say you should never compare African history to other people's history, but I think there's nothing more important than comparing it, because if we can station which kings were around at the same time, we can actually start to plot the timeline in a way that starts to make more sense, to understand that at the time of India colonizing the Indonesian areas and Myanmar and those places, the people of southern Africa were expanding and communicating in large amounts from like Zimbabwe to South Africa to Kenya to the Swahili coast to Ethiopia. And that entire region knew about each other from around 700 AD, even though the people who are related to those people, in other words, the Arabs and all the other people, Indians, had no idea there was such a stretch of a world. And this stretch, by the way, which there's evidence of this, even though it didn't necessarily go with beads, the evidence of this stretches as far as the Cape of Good Hope, where we find the exact same pieces made in one place. So in South Africa's coast, in the KwaZulu Natal regions, we find some of the pottery from there in Cape Town, so opposite of where that is. See, guilds, merchant guilds, which are seen in some of those places of Indonesia and India as early merchandising at a global scale, seem to have existed all over the place in Africa. And that's what makes Africa a little bit different. That when people try to look and try to see, they see the same things going on there that they see everywhere else. And that is kind of one of the things that I call a fluke of the map, which we will get into some other time. This is a image showing Indonesian ship. Now, I will come back to all of that and what it really means and this large exploration. And of course, Albuquerque, who says, I saw a map in Africa that in Indonesia that had Africa, India, Brazil, all these other places. And it's like, well, if you take these guilds, if you take these explorations, if you take all of these, not only does it seem possible, it seems impossible that the people who lived at this time could not go to the Americas. But that's the world that we live in.